Star Wars 7x7 episode 1904 today. We are looking at the final stories in Star Wars Myths and Fables by George Mann, and all three of the stories we're going to talk about today have connections to other Star Wars stories. Punch it! Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode. So yeah, we are at the final three stories in Myths and Fables, and as with the previous two episodes, this is a spoiler episode, so if you have not read these stories and don't want them spoiled for you, then save this show for a later date. Otherwise, if you're okay with me diving into the details of Vengeful Waves and The Witch and the Wookiee and Gaze of Stone, well then let's dig in. First of all, I'll tell you that Gaze of Stone we'll talk about after the break, not just yet. We'll start off with Vengeful Waves. I said at the top that each of these stories ties in to another Star Wars story that's out there, and in this particular case, it's to a Choose Your Own Destiny book. That's one of the Choose Your Own Adventure style books that's been written. This one featuring Obi-Wan and Anakin and written by Cavan Scott. And in that story, Obi-Wan and Anakin travel to Glee Anselm, where they encounter the Anselmi people who are really having a tough time of it surviving and so on and so forth. And all they've heard from Kit Fisto, who is also from Glee Anselm and is a Natolan, is that the Anselmi people are little more than savages, and they used to live on land, but their land sunk to the seabed a millennia ago. Well, the reason that happened is told in the Vengeful Waves story, where basically the Anselmi and the Natolans lived in harmony until the Anselmi started to look at the grass on the other side of the line and think, oh yeah, it's kind of greener over there, we want it, and started getting greedy, and the Natolans said, oh, you can have a little bit more land, that's fine, and the Anselmi were like, ha ha ha, they just gave it to us, we're just going to keep asking, we're going to take more, and ultimately the Natolans, who, were happy to fight them if they had to, well, not happy to fight them, just, that was the last resort, but were not worried about fighting because they were all skilled warriors, and so they could have taken the Anselmi on if they needed to, but the Anselmi ultimately said, well, fine, if you're not going to give us any more territory, then we will just conquer the land instead. And the Natolans tried to say, hey, the ocean spirit is not going to be happy about this. Of course, the Anselmi were like, yeah, right, whatever. And so the Anselmi took over the land and prospered and flourished, and yet were still angry about everything and thought they deserved everything and thought, hey, now that we've taken over all the land, we need more land. So they built dams to push the ocean back even, and that was the final straw for the ocean spirit, and the ocean spirit utterly wiped out their dams, ultimately wiped out the cities that they'd built on land, sank land to the floor of the sea, and so ultimately only a handful of Anselmi survivors were left after the vengeful ocean spirit had its way with them. And whatever civilization they had built up over those years while they were living on land, well, yeah, they kind of regressed basically to, as Kit Fisto had described it, be little more than savages who, hunted for food and who made sacrifices to ancient spirits, hoping that they would restore all of the bountiful things that they had had in the past. And yeah, obviously that's not working. So anyway, that's the general gist of Vengeful Waves. Then there's The Witch and the Wookiee. And this one ties into the long-lost mobile game Star Wars Uprising. Now, I've mentioned that game here on the podcast from time to time, and there was somebody whose name escapes me now, and I have this tucked away in a file someplace, who had compiled all of the story elements from the Star Wars Uprising game. The game is no longer available, you can't check it out anymore, so it's kind of a lost thing, but this one person had managed to gather all of them and throw them in a PDF document. It's something like 160 odd pages long, had posted it on the Force.net's forums, and I have a copy of that. He put it out there, for anyone to grab and have, and it's something that I have thought about coming back to every so often, and who knows, when The Rise of Skywalker comes out, there's going to be a time period when you and I will not want to be anywhere near social media because we'll all be concerned that we're going to hear something spoilery and we don't want it ruined for us. So, we've done Safe Week here in the past, and sometimes Safe Week has lasted 2 weeks. So I think it's possible that's one of the candidates for what to do during Safe Week is to look at the storyline for Star Wars Uprising and be able to talk about that safely, so that way you can still have some Star Wars stuff to listen to without any concern that The Rise of Skywalker will be ruined for you in December. Another thing I'm thinking about doing is talking about the Jedi Fallen Order walkthrough at that time, because in 2017 during Safe Week, instead of talking about The Last Jedi before the movie came out, we went through the walkthrough of Battlefront 2. So it would be nice to do that again. So if you have an opinion about that, then I would love to hear it wherever you happen to catch this episode that has a comment section, or at sw7x7.com for this episode if it doesn't. Like if you're listening to it via audio. Anyway, The Witch and the Wookiee involves Shelish, who is a Night Sister, and her Wookiee familiar, as he's described, a Watchie, a Wookiee who is somebody who accompanies her. And this takes place possibly sometime during the Empire, in other words, before the events of Star Wars Uprising. At least that's how it's sort of portrayed in the story, because it talks about the Emperor being able to, in theory, see everything going on in the Empire, but being distracted by having to quell rebellions and whatnot. And so these pirates who managed to get away with a whole bunch of loot also betrayed part of their crew and had to go on the run too. And so it's a classic sort of bank robbery story where they agree to find some out-of-the-way place where they can hide their loot, the three of them, and then they'll all go their separate ways off into wild space or something. And then at an appointed time later on, come back and grab the loot because things are just too hot right now. So they end up on the moon Jas Krill, and Jas is a planet in the Hoth system, along with Hoth itself. Jas Krill is a foreboding place, a twisty, swampy, nightmarish place where, as they are trying to find some sort of cave, some sort of hollow, some sort of place where they can stash the treasure and start getting lost and freaked out in the middle of the night in the woods, they come across a cottage in the middle of nowhere, very Hansel and Gretel-like, and there is a witch inside. It happens to be a Night Sister by the name of Shelish, and they take advantage of her generosity. She feeds them and gives them drink, but they look around and there's tons of treasure in her house, and they're like, how did this all get here? Well, there's more treasure here than is on our ship, so why don't we just kill this old lady and take her treasure, and then we can store our treasure in here along with her treasure. But that doesn't go so well as you might imagine. And I mean really badly, because they, at least they managed to escape with their lives, but that's only because the Night Sister Shelish calls off the Wookiee Owachi. He would have just torn the heck out of him. Torn limb from limb, as it's described in the book. But ultimately, the Dathomirian Night Sister is able to use her magic to somehow steal the treasure from out under the pirates' noses. And so, yeah, she ends up getting more treasure, which it seems like this is something that she's done with quite a few pirates who have strayed in her path, I would imagine. Again, I'm unfamiliar with the character except to know that she was part of Star Wars Uprising, so maybe that fits in with her personality. Maybe it doesn't in the game. I don't know. We'll find out. Maybe later this year when we dig into Star Wars Uprising. And then there's Gaze of Stone, which connects to another Cavan Scott story, and a more adult one by comparison. I'll explain after the break. Stay tuned. This episode is brought to you by Constant Contact, the premier email marketing solution for small businesses and organizations. I've used their service since 2003, and over the past decade and a half, I've watched them evolve, make the product simpler, more powerful, easy to use, and do everything that they can to help train people to use the product more effectively and for it to work with other forms of marketing like social media, for example. So check out sw7x7.com/email to learn more about Constant Contact and start a free trial. Once again, that is sw7x7.com/email for a free trial. Welcome back. So, Gaze of Stone is also one of my favorite stories in this whole thing, and it talks about a Twi'lek statue on the planet Moraband, aka Korriban, as it was known in days of yore. This is, of course, the Sith homeworld, and this statue has been there for many, 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 many years, and nobody knows what the deal is with it. Some people have even seen it weeping a single dark tear from time to time, and so all sorts of stories have grown up around it, but Myths and Fables purports to tell us the story of who this person was and how he came to be encased in stone. And encased is actually the correct phrasing in this place, horrific as it may be. It concerns the story of a Twi'lek named Rye Nimbus, who was definitely very strong in the Force when he was young, but not in a good way. And ultimately, some traveler comes by and manages to convince Rye's mother that he can be trained in the Force, and that this person traveling says, I can help out with this. And I guess it must have been a time where, hey, just anybody can show up and say, oh, that kid's strong in the Force, we take Force kids, and people just did it, right? Again, that's sort of taking it literally, and yes, we're not supposed to take these two literally, but you get what I mean. Anyway, it turns out that this traveler was not necessarily a nice person. It was in fact Darth Calduth. And Darth Calduth was a character that was also briefly mentioned in the Dooku Jedi Lost audio drama from Cavan Scott. So apparently Cavan Scott and George Mann got to talking from time to time and managed to tie their stuff together. At least this is according to an interview on StarWars.com. So that's good fun seeing those connections happen. And so Darth Calduth said, hey, I'm going to train you, and then actually dropped Rye off on a planet where he was basically forced to become a pit fighter and have a horrible life. But naturally, because he was so strong in the Force, he managed to become a great fighter and survive. And 7 years later, Calduth comes and picks him up. And once Rye recognizes who Calduth is, he attacks him, but nope, that doesn't work, because Calduth is, of course, the master in this case, and even cuts off one of Rye's leku, one of his head tails, to say, hey, I'm putting you in your place, and now I'm ready to train you for reals. And so they go off together and have all sorts of adventures, but eventually, as happens with Sith, they, start to not get along too well, and Nimbus thinks that Calduth is holding back information from Nimbus that could help him grow, and is starting to get jealous and resentful, and tries to figure out a way to get back at Calduth and probably take his place as master and end up getting his own Sith apprentice. So there is a time where they go to Moraband, and Calduth says to Rye Nimbus, hey, make me a statue, and not in the classic way, like, boom, you're a statue. No, not like that. No, construct a statue of me so that way people can bow down and worship me and see how awesome I am. Well, it turns out that there was some alchemical ritual that Nimbus could have chanted that would have turned his master Darth Calduth to stone, would have turned his skin to stone and made him be frozen for eternity, trapped in that living nightmare. But Calduth apparently suspected this one, saw it was coming, and very sneakily changed the wording in the ritual so that way when Nimbus recited it, it wasn't Calduth that turned to stone, it was actually Rye Nimbus himself. And these three stories all seem to have a bit of a common theme, if you will, as well. And that is about the nature of greed and about how nothing goes right when you succumb to it. Whether it's the Anselmi, who were greedy and jealous over the success of the Natolans and just wanted more and more and more and couldn't be satisfied and didn't respect the balance that had previously existed, right? Or the pirates in The Witch and the Wookiee, who could have just been happy with the treasure that they'd had, but they got greedy and tried to get Shellish's treasure as well, and obviously that didn't work out for them. Or you have Rye Nimbus, who was greedy for more power and thought that his master was withholding from him, which he probably was anyway, but thinking that, all right, I've had it, I'm going to, take away from him what is his. Yeah, greed, never the answer, and it doesn't seem to matter whether you're just generally good, like the Anselmi were generally good until they started getting unhappy with things, or whether you're scoundrels like the pirates, or whether you're just straight up evil like the Sith. Though I have to say, it's kind of hard to feel sympathy for Ride Nimbus, per se, all things considered. And also, the other moral of that story is never read an ancient ritual that you don't understand, because you don't know what you're going to get yourself into, quite literally. And that is going to wrap up our discussion of Star Wars Myths and Fables by George Mann, and that's going to wrap up our episode here today as well. Thank you so much for joining me for it, as always, and may the Force be with you, wherever in the world you may be.
This podcast is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox. It is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other related Star Wars items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2019 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.